5 years old, and my mother teaching me the 100th Psalm and the 23rd Psalm. And I think it was just because I liked to lay up close to her and quote them, and she would, oh, that was so good, that's so good. But many of us, if you don't have that heritage or that legacy of being raised in a Bible home, let's call it that, in many cases we look at the Bible and we're just a little bit intimidated and even confused and discombobulated. We may turn to Psalms and read, beautiful poetry, but have no idea of where that comes from and how it fits into things. Or here's my favorite. Let's start with Revelation. I've been wondering about Revelation, so we try to accommodate that. Very difficult to understand Revelation, even if you have a great understanding of both the Old and the New Covenant. Having said that, there are a few unifying themes that run through the Bible. The Bible is really one book. It's 66 segments, if you want to call it, but it's one book from the mind of God to the hearts and minds of humans. And once you see that, a lot of things make sense. We know the creation stories from Genesis. We learn those. But a figure of great significance in the Old Testament is Abraham. And I won't go into all of that, but we begin reading about him in the book of Genesis after the great flood in which Noah and his family, his household, were saved. We're simply told that Abraham believed God and God credited it for righteousness. Now, it doesn't mean that Abraham was perfect. Abraham was not an angel, and he committed some grievous mistakes. But because he believed not only in God, which is a distinction, he not only believed in God as a supreme being, but he believed God when God spoke. And Abraham demonstrated that on multiple occasions. Abraham was raised. He wasn't raised in the church. Abraham was raised in an idolatrous society in the lower Mesopotamian area, what is now Babylonia, in a city called Ur. And as an aside, and I keep interrupting myself, Joe and Sandy, but as an aside, the city of Ur has been extensively excavated today. We have thousands, over 10,000 records on clay of the business activities of the city of Ur, and we know a lot about it. There was one clay tablet that was sort of we would almost call it like a recall. Somebody had bought a chariot and the wheel had fallen off of the chariot. And the guy who had bought the chariot kind of wanted a refund on what he paid. But mundane business things we have from the city of Ur. It was a thriving city. God said, get up out of Ur, out of this idolatrous area, and you're going to go to a place I'm going to show you. And Abraham essentially said, okay, we'll go. We'll pick up our family. They went to Haran, which is in northern Syria, and stayed there for a while. But then God said, come on down. You're going to go into a land which I will give to your ancestors. But it was believed, it's because Abraham not only believed in God as a supreme being, but he believed God and he acted upon the faith. That is a really simple but important principle. It's not enough to just believe in God or to believe in Jesus, but it's important that we believe them when they speak to us. So where are we going on this? Because Abraham believed God and God credited him to righteousness, God made really a unilateral series of promises, which we would call, in his call, a covenant. We know a lot about ancient covenants in 2000 years BC. We know the parts of them. They were typically sworn to by the gods, the little g, of the people making the covenant. But covenants were common between kings and princes and princes and things of that nature. They were it would always include a meal, and a covenant was not just a promise like, yeah, I'll do business with you. I'll deliver, 40 tons of cedar and you'll pay me X amount. No, it was a solemn promise, and you basically were putting your life at stake when you made a covenant. God makes a unilateral covenant in this case. I want to read a few verses just to show what we're talking about here. In the 15th chapter of Genesis, God had already made some promises to Abram that he would be a great nation. But Abram at this point had no son, had no heir to carry out those promises. So Abraham, you can just see the wheels turn. God, I believe you, but I don't have an heir now. Duh. And remember, they tried to circumvent God's will by having Ishmael by a handmaiden by the name of Hagar. But in chapter 15, Abram said, "O Lord Yahweh," meaning God, what will you give me as I go on being childless and heir of my house is Eliezer? So it was a servant's son in his household. And Abram says, "Since you have given no seed to me, no male heirs, behold, one born in my house is my heir." I say, boy, that seems strange. Like this guy's just living in your house, he's going to be your heir. We now know extensive things about that situation from the ancient civilization. That if people did not have a male heir, then servants born in their households could, in fact, take on that position. Then behold the word of Yahweh. Now God speaks, and he says, "This one will not be your heir." Eleazar, no, he's not it. "But the one who will come forth from your own body." Now, how old is Abraham? He's around 90 something at this time. I'm not quite that old, Joe, but I'm pushing 80. Don't anticipate any more children. That would be a true miracle if that occurred. But God says it's going to come from your own body. He shall be your heir. And he brought him outside. That is, God brought Abraham out. Says, "Look out toward the heavens and number the stars if you're able to number them." And he said to him, "So shall your seed be." Here's a guy who has no male heir at that time. And God says, "Look at the stars. That's how plentiful and innumerable your seed is going to be." And in verse 6, then he believed in Yahweh. He didn't just believe in Yahweh, but he believed and acted upon Yahweh's promises, and he counted it to him for righteousness. God counted it to Abram for righteousness. Now, God says, "I am Yahweh, I'm God, who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans," and we talked about that, "to give you this land, Israel, to possess it," Canaan at that point. So he, that is God, said to him, "Bring me a 3-year-old heifer." If you weren't raised where in the farm country, a heifer is a female cow. Okay, it's a young, usually female cow, and a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, that's a male sheep, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. It's like you're starting a zoo. I mean, it's just all these animals. And so here's what happened in verse 10. He brought all these to him and split them into parts down the middle, cuts the goat in half, cuts the sheep and the heifer in half, cuts the ram in half, cuts the birds in half. And we say, what is this? This is weird. We now know again from contemporaneous documents of that time that this was how they cut a covenant. And if you didn't know that and you said they cut a covenant, well, what are they talking about? They literally took animals, they cut them apart, and the two parties to the covenant, say the king over here and the king over here, would walk through the cut parts of that animal to signify the solemnness. And what they were really saying is, if I don't keep my end of this promise, I'm going to be cut like these animals. That was part of it. So it was a warning. But in this case, the birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. Now, here's where I'm getting to. It happened that when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. So he's out of it. And behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. God said to Abram, "Know for certain that your seed will be sojourners in a land," and we know from the rest of the story that's Egypt, where Abraham, Isaac, Jacob's 12 sons and their family came down into Egypt for roughly 400 years. "But I will judge that nation," meaning Egypt, "to whom they are enslaved." And in verse 17, the point I'm getting to, now it happened that the sun had set and it was very dark after they had cut these animals. This is strange. And there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between these pieces. Those were clearly the evidences of God passing through those pieces. But it was a unilateral covenant. There is no mention of Abraham having done it. You see what I'm saying? This was a pure act of grace from God, but it was because Abram had believed God and then believed in God and then believed God's promises, and God counted it for righteousness. My point is this, and I've been lengthy in getting to this point. The initial promises of Abraham, to Abraham, your people are going to be innumerable, going to be a great nation. You're going to have this land upon which your foot has trod for the generations. That means through the ages, and the entire world. This was added later. Will be blessed through your seed, and the rest of the Old Testament into the New Testament is the unfolding of those promises to Abraham, where God protects this people, the children of Abraham and the descendants, protects them, keeps them in a monotheistic people, surrounded by the polytheistic and idolatrous nations around him. That's the story of the Old Testament. Now, did the Jews always follow? No, they left him, and God punished them with captivity. But he brought a remnant back to preserve that bloodline, so that when you open up Matthew and you open up Luke, one of the first things you see is a genealogy showing how Jesus goes all the way back to David, and then all the way back, to Adam, of course, through Abraham. You say, okay, what's that got to do with anything? Well, I'm going to try to explain it in a short manner. Sandy, proceed. Then we have the covenant, and I'll just mention it, between Moses and God. And that is what is typically referred to as the Old Covenant or the Old Testament. Paul later calls that a covenant of sin and death. Why would he call it that? Pretty harsh, isn't it? Because the basic foundation of that covenant was the soul that sinneth shall die. But you won't die immediately if you continue to do sacrifices as commanded by that covenant. So that was a two-way covenant. God says, I will be your God, you will be my people, but as my people, you have these obligations. Most people say, oh, you're talking about 10 commandments? There's actually 613 commandments. Lots of you shall do this, you shall do that, and a whole bunch of you shall not do this and not do that. Lots of commandments. Try living under 613 commandments and see how perfect you achieve. What perfection. So for 1,500 years, roughly, under Moses, these people had these commandments. It weighed on them like, the biggest load, because they knew they couldn't follow it in with perfection. And so how did you prevent the death that was promised? Is these continuous sacrifices, not just one a day, but thousands over years, millions really over years, to forestall the ultimate, the immediate death of sin. And so then we get to a prophet, Jeremiah. Where does he fit into the picture? He is prophesying prior to the children of Israel, the southern nation of Judah, being led into captivity in Babylonia, roughly 600 years before Christ, roughly 600 years. And Jeremiah, through the inspiration of Scripture, and I doubt he even knew what he was talking about, other than mouthing the words that the Spirit gave him. In chapter 31 of verse 31. See, I'm from the South. I typically talk real slow. So I'm actually trying to talk faster now. And we'll get to this point. So Jeremiah says in chapter 31, behold, the days are coming, declares Yahweh, God, when I will cut a new covenant. This is the Legacy Standard Bible, and that's a good translation. With the house of Judah. Not like the covenant which I cut with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So here he's talking about that covenant with Moses. I will be your people. I'll be your God, you will be my people. So it's not going to be like that covenant, um, which they broke, and I was a husband to them. But this is the covenant which I will cut with the house of Israel. I will put my law within them. So the law in the new covenant is not going to be on tablets of stone. It's not going to just be a series of thou shalt and thou shalt not. And on their heart I will write it. Under the new covenant, in the individual who accepts that covenant, it will be within their heart, in spirit and in truth, as we learn later on. Now, where are you going with this, Al? I'm gonna tell you. We're almost there. And this is what prompted my remarks today. We've been studying the book of Luke, and so this will be familiar to several of us. In the Last Supper, as it is so called, Jesus and his 12 apostles, and many of us are familiar with this. Jesus took bread, unleavened bread, because it was the Passover season. And he said, take and eat, all of you, and he gave thanks for that. And then he took a cup of wine or grape juice or fruit of the vine, and he said, this cup, this contents really, which is poured out for you, is the new covenant in my blood. Ooh, wow. What was Jeremiah talking about? Talking about a new covenant. So Jesus is taking an old Passover meal and he's giving it a totally new meaning. And it's the Lord's Supper that we still commemorate. And he says, do this in remembrance of me. For nearly 2,000 years, Christians have been doing it. So what is this new covenant? And what does Abraham have to do with it? Paul would say in Galatians that Abraham is the father of the faith. So if you and I are Christians, we can look back to Abraham, not in the details of what he was given to do, but in the fundamentals of he believed God and believed in God as the supreme being in an idolatrous world. And he believed God when God said and gave him those promises and then later gave him the commandments. I would say that's the string that runs through the Old and the New Testament. As Christians, we've got to not just believe in God, because that might have been even just poured into us, but we've got to believe God when he tells us what to do.